The county threw $500,000 of diesel and steel at the 30-acre bottom, trying to beat the swamp. They failed. Left it to rot. But where excavators sank and bureaucrats quit, 3,000 hungry, loud, messy ducks thrived. This is how the worst mud in the valley became a gold mine. The smell hit you first. It wasn't just water. It was standing, baking water that had drowned 3 years of soybeans and was currently fermenting a thick, choking mat of smartweed and algae. It smelled like sulfur, dead carp, and bankruptcy. Ruth stood at the edge of the tree line, her muck boots sinking 2 inches into the grey clay, just staring out at the 30-acre bottom. It was the lowest point in Otago County. Geographically, it was a bowl. Economically, it was an open vein, bleeding her farm dry. The water sat. It didn't ripple. It just baked under the relentless August sun, breeding mosquitoes so thick you could wipe them off your neck with a trowel. 30 acres didn't sound like much to the mega-farms out west, but to Ruth's 180-acre operation, it was the difference between keeping the tractor running and handing the keys over to the bank. She turned and looked at the twisted, rusted mass of corrugated metal piping jutting out of the ditch near the road, the county's big fix. 2 years ago, the county drainage board had rolled in with excavators, a diesel pump the size of a shipping container, and a lot of empty promises. A man named Greg from the commissioner's office had stood in her driveway, wearing spotless khakis and a hard hat he didn't need, pointing at laminated blueprints. He had talked about runoff trajectories, hydrostatic pressure, and municipal easements. He promised the new culvert system would pull the water out of the bottom and push it 2 miles south to the river. They dug. They laid the pipe. They turned the pump on. It worked for exactly 3 weeks. Then the spring rains hit, the river backed up, and the silt came. The heavy, cement-like mud of the valley floor slid into the county's expensive new trenches, crushing the corrugated pipes like aluminum cans. The pump choked on the sludge, blew a seal, and sat idle for 6 months while the county argued with the contractor over who was liable. In the end, nobody was. The county declared the 30-acre bottom a recurrent natural wetland hazard. They packed up their surviving equipment and drove away. Greg didn't come back to the driveway. He sent a letter. 2 paragraphs of bureaucratic apathy explaining that further drainage attempts were not economically viable for the district. The water was hers to keep. Ruth kicked a clod of dirt into the stagnant water. A bullfrog croaked lazily from the reeds. She had tried everything. She had rented a trencher herself, burning through diesel she couldn't afford, trying to cut relief ditches into the hardpan. The mud just slumped back in on itself overnight. She tried planting moisture-tolerant cover crops. The seeds rotted in the anaerobic soup before they could germinate. It was a dead zone, and the property taxes on that dead zone were still due on the 1st of November. That night, Ruth sat at her kitchen table. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. The kitchen table was the war room. It was buried in ledgers, unpaid invoices from the co-op, and a stack of mail she hadn't opened because she already knew what the envelopes contained. She traced a pencil down the column of her ledger. The math was brutal. Without the yield from the bottom, the remaining 150 acres of corn couldn't carry the mortgage. The margins were too thin. Fertilizer costs had doubled. Fuel was up. The yield on the high ground was decent, but it wasn't enough to drag 30 acres of dead weight across the finish line. She needed that land. She needed it producing. She rubbed her eyes, pressing the heels of her hands hard until colors bloomed in the dark. She thought about selling it. But who buys a swamp? Duck hunters, maybe. But the county had an easement right through the middle, meaning no permanent structures, no hunting blinds. It was worthless. She opened her laptop. The screen cast a harsh, blue light across her tired face. She typed in variations of the same desperate queries she'd been searching for months. How to drain heavy clay, farming flooded bottomland, cheap agricultural pumps. The results were always the same. Buy expensive tile drainage. Buy a bigger pump. Lobby your local government. She scoffed, the sound loud and bitter in the empty kitchen. The local government was currently ignoring her calls, and the bank wasn't going to finance a massive tiling project on land that looked like a scene from the Mesozoic era. She clicked through forums, old message boards from the early 2000s, advice from farmers in Louisiana, advice from rice growers in Arkansas. It was around 2 in the morning, her coffee cold and bitter in the mug, when she stumbled onto an archived thread on an obscure permaculture site. Someone was talking about the historical use of livestock in floodplains. Not cattle. Cattle would sink to their bellies and rot their hooves in the mud. Not pigs. Birds. Ruth leaned closer to the screen. She read about integrated rice and duck farming in Asia. She read about how the constant paddling of webbed feet agitated the water, preventing algae blooms, how the bills rooted in the mud, aerating the soil and breaking up the hardpan, how they ate every mosquito larva, snail and weed seed they could find, converting wetland waste into high-nitrogen fertilizer. It wasn't a drainage solution. It was a complete pivot. If she couldn't beat the water, she would have to use it. She looked at her ledger. Buying a new pump was $30,000. Trenching was $10,000. Ducks were $3 apiece. It was a stupid idea. It was the kind of idea born of exhaustion, impending bankruptcy, and a deep, simmering anger at the county. It was a massive gamble. Ruth closed the laptop. She didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning, she picked up her phone and called a commercial hatchery 2 states over. "You bought what?" Frank leaned against the rusted fender of his pickup truck, an unlit cigarette hanging loosely from his lips. He was Ruth's nearest neighbor, a man who had farmed soybeans his whole life and believed anything that couldn't be fixed with a wrench or sprayed with a tractor was a waste of time. "Ducks, Frank," Ruth said, her voice flat, betraying none of the absolute terror churning in her stomach. 3,000 of them. Frank took the cigarette out of his mouth and stared at her. He looked past her, toward the 30-acre bottom, then back at her. "Ruth, honey, the heat's getting to you. You don't have a pond. You have a cesspool. Coyotes are going to treat this place like an all-you-can-eat buffet." "I got fencing," Ruth said, pointing to the rolls of electric poultry netting stacked in the back of her flatbed. "And I'm getting 2 livestock guardian dogs from a rescue down in the city. The ducks arrive on Tuesday." Frank shook his head slowly, the way a doctor might when delivering bad news. "The bank is going to laugh you right out of the county." "The bank is already doing that, Frank," Ruth snapped, the exhaustion finally bleeding into her voice. "The county left me with a bathtub full of rot. I can't plant it. I can't drain it. So I'm going to farm the water." Tuesday arrived with the sound of a rumbling diesel engine and a smell that would haunt Ruth for weeks. The transport truck backed down the gravel lane, shifting gears with a mechanical groan. When the driver threw open the rear doors, a wall of noise hit the farm. It wasn't just quacking. It was a chaotic, high-pitched, deafening roar of 3,000 anxious, thirsty Indian runner and khaki Campbell crosses. They weren't the pretty white ducks you see in storybooks. These were working birds. Upright, restless, their feathers a mottled mix of browns, tans, and greys. They moved like a single, liquid organism, shifting and rippling inside the plastic transport crates. Ruth handed the driver a cashier's check. It represented the very last of her operating credit. If this failed, there was no backup plan. There was no safety net. There was only the auctioneer's gavel. Together with 2 hired high school kids from town, they spent 6 grueling hours unloading the crates at the edge of the bottom. The electric fencing was up, a sprawling, jagged perimeter enclosing the worst of the flooded acreage. "All right," Ruth breathed, wiping sweat and dirt from her forehead. "Let 'em out." They opened the crates. For a moment, nothing happened. The birds huddled inside, wary of the new light. Then, one brave runner stepped out, its head bobbing rhythmically. It smelled the water. It let out a sharp, demanding quack. Then the dam broke. A tidal wave of feathers poured from the crates. 3,000 ducks sprinted, stumbled, and flapped down the slight incline toward the stagnant water. The noise was incredible, a drumming of webbed feet on clay, followed by the massive, collective splash as they hit the flooded bottom. Ruth stood on the bank and watched. It wasn't a graceful ballet, it was a riot. The ducks hit the thick algae mats and immediately went to work. Bills plunged into the murky water. Mud flew into the air. They tore at the invasive smartweed. They chased water bugs with ruthless efficiency. Within an hour, the water at the edge of the property line was unrecognizable. Where it had been perfectly still and covered in a thick green scum, it was now churning. It looked like a boiling pot of brown soup. That night, Ruth sat on the tailgate of her truck, wrapped in a heavy flannel shirt, staring out at the darkness. The 2 Pyrenees mixes she had adopted, massive, white mountains of fur named Brick and Mortar, prowled the perimeter of the electric fence. The silence of the bottom was gone. Even in the dark, she could hear the soft, continuous sound of water being disturbed. Splashing. Dabbling. Low, conversational quacks. She didn't feel victorious. She felt terrified. She had just dumped thousands of prey animals into a predator-rich environment, relying on thin plastic netting and 2 untested dogs to keep her investment alive. She was deeply in debt, and her solution was currently eating mosquito larvae in the dark. The first 2 weeks were hell. Frank had been right about the coyotes. They tested the fence on the 3rd night. Ruth woke up to the deep, thunderous barking of the dogs and the frantic splashing of a panicked flock. She ran out in her boots and nightgown, a flashlight in one hand and a rifle in the other. She found Brick pacing aggressively at a corner of the fence, the wire shorted out by a fallen branch. She lost 14 ducks that night. Little piles of brown feathers in the mud. She spent the next day reinforcing the fence, covered in mud up to her elbows, crying tears of sheer frustration that she angrily wiped away with a dirty sleeve. But as the days bled into weeks, a rhythm established itself. The dogs learned the perimeter. The coyotes learned to stay away from the heavy white dogs. And the ducks did exactly what they were bred to do. By the end of week 3, Ruth walked down to the edge of the water. She stopped. She listened. The high-pitched, maddening whine of mosquitoes, a constant soundtrack to the bottomland for 3 years, was gone. She stepped closer to the edge. The thick, suffocating mats of duckweed and algae had been entirely consumed. The water was no longer black and stagnant. It was muddy, yes, constantly churned by thousands of paddling feet. But it was alive. More importantly, she noticed the smell. The sulfuric stench of rotting vegetation was fading. In its place was the earthy, potent smell of ammonia and manure. 3,000 ducks eat a lot, but what goes in must come out. They were blanketing the 30 acres with an incredible amount of raw, nitrogen-rich fertilizer, and because they were constantly swimming and rooting, they were aggressively tilling that fertilizer directly into the submerged clay. The water level hadn't dropped. The county's failed drainage pipe still sat rusting in the ditch. But the nature of the water was changing. The duck's constant rooting was breaking up the impenetrable top layer of hardpan. One afternoon, Greg from the county office drove by. He slowed his white fleet truck to a crawl, leaning over the steering wheel to stare out the passenger window at the chaotic sea of ducks swarming over the land his board had written off. Ruth happened to be out by the road, checking the solar charger for the fence. She stood up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and locked eyes with him through the glass. She didn't wave, she didn't smile. She just stared at him until he nervously tapped the gas and sped away down the county road. She turned back to the bottom. The ducks were moving in a massive, coordinated sweep across the shallows, their bills chattering against the mud. It was messy. It was loud. It was deeply unconventional. But as Ruth looked down at the soft, oxygenated mud near her boots, where green shoots of natural sedge were beginning to push through the previously dead soil, she realized something. She wasn't trying to beat the swamp anymore. She was putting it to work. Winter came fast, biting through the thin canvas of Ruth's jacket. The 30-acre bottom froze, thawed, and froze again. The ducks had grown. They were massive, loud, and incredibly fat. The constant foraging, supplemented by whatever cheap grain Ruth could scrape together, had turned the 3,000 scrawny ducklings into a premium flock. But they were eating her out of house and home, and the frozen ground meant they couldn't forage anymore. It was time for the second half of the gamble. You don't just load 3,000 ducks into a pickup and drive to the local livestock auction. Commodity auctions pay pennies per pound. Ruth needed a premium price to offset her debts. So she spent her evenings on the phone, calling specialty butchers, high-end distributors, and ethnic markets in the city 3 hours east. She found a buyer, a wholesale distributor named Peterson, who supplied upscale culinary markets. He drove out in late November, stepping gingerly around the mud in expensive boots, eyeing the flock. He bought the entire lot. The payout didn't make her rich. After renting the processing equipment, paying the hired hands, and settling the feed bill, she cleared just enough to pay the property taxes, service the mortgage, and keep the bank off her porch for another year. She ended the year exactly where she started, broke, but breathing. Then came spring. The thaw usually brought the flood. For 3 years, March meant watching the 30-acre bottom turn into a shallow lake, waiting for the county's failed pump to miraculously start working. This year, Ruth stood at the tree line and stared. The water was gone. It wasn't magic. It was biology. The ducks had spent months driving their bills deep into the clay, pulling up roots, eating the binding weed mats, and churning raw manure into the earth. The constant agitation had shattered the impenetrable layer of hardpan that had held the water like a porcelain bowl. Now, the soil was porous. The winter melt didn't pool. It infiltrated. Frank rolled down her driveway in his rusted truck, parking next to where Ruth stood. He killed the engine and stepped out, a fresh, unlit cigarette hanging from his mouth. He looked out at the bottom. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Where there had once been a foul, grey expanse of cracked clay and stagnant pools, there was now a sprawling expanse of rich, dark earth. It looked black, almost purple in the morning light. It was spongy underfoot, thick with decomposing organic matter. "You think you can get a tractor in there?" Frank asked, kicking at the dirt. Ruth bent down and scooped up a handful of soil. It crumbled perfectly between her fingers, smelling of deep, sweet earth rather than sulfur. I don't need the big tractor. I just need the planter." She didn't plant soybeans. The soil was too hot, too rich in pure nitrogen from the duck manure. She planted corn, high-density, high-yield corn. The planting was nerve-wracking. The ground was still soft in spots, and the old John Deere tractor bogged down twice, requiring Frank to come pull her out with his chain, but she got the seed in the ground. By June, the rest of the county was struggling. A localized drought had hit the valley. The rain stopped for 3 weeks. Frank's fields up on the ridge turned a sickly, pale green, the stalks stunting under the relentless sun. Down in the 30-acre bottom, the corn exploded. It was a jungle. The deep clay, newly aerated by the ducks and rich with organic matter, held on to moisture like a sponge. The roots dove deep. While the high ground baked, the bottomland thrived. The stalks grew thick as broom handles, pushing 10 feet high, dark green and vibrating with health. Ruth walked the rows in late July. The air inside the cornfield was humid, smelling of pollen and raw growth. She reached out and felt a developing ear. It was massive, heavy in her hand. She stripped back the husk slightly. Perfect, even rows of kernels. She walked back to her truck, sat on the tailgate, and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 years. Word got around. In a farming community, you can hide a lot of things, but you can't hide a bumper crop. Neighbors who had whispered about the crazy woman with the ducks started slowing down on the county road, peering through their dusty windshields at the wall of dark green corn filling the depression. August brought the heat, but it didn't break the crop. Ruth spent her nights poring over the old ledgers, the ones stained with coffee rings and tears from the year before. The math was changing. She ran the projections again and again. If the weather held, if a sudden hailstorm didn't flatten the valley, the bottom was going to cover the entire farm's operating debt. Frank stopped by on a Tuesday evening, bringing a 6-pack of cheap beer. They sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the tree line, casting long, golden shadows across the tops of the corn. "Looks like a yield monitor is going to blow a fuse down there," Frank said, popping the tab on a can and handing it to her. "We'll see," Ruth said softly. She refused to jinx it. Farming was a religion of managed disappointment. You didn't celebrate until the grain was in the bin. "You talked to the county lately?" Frank asked, a sly grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "They sent the tax assessment. That's about it." "Well, Greg from the commissioner's office was at the diner this morning," Frank chuckled, taking a long pull of beer, talking loud about how the natural drainage table finally corrected itself, trying to take credit for the bottom drying out. Ruth stopped the can halfway to her mouth. She looked at Frank. "He said what?" "Said the hydrostatic pressure equalized, just like he predicted in his reports." Frank shook his head. "I told him he was full of it. Told him it was bird shit and webbed feet. He didn't like that much." Ruth felt a hot spike of anger, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a cold, hard sense of satisfaction. Let them talk. Let the county file their reports and pat themselves on the back in their air-conditioned offices. They hadn't stood in the freezing mud at 2 a.m, patching an electric fence. They hadn't gambled their livelihood on 3,000 noisy, messy birds. The bottom belonged to her. The ducks had reclaimed it. Harvest came in late October. The air turned crisp, carrying the dusty mechanical smell of diesel and dry chaff. Ruth leased a combine. She couldn't afford to buy one, and her old machine had thrown a rod 2 seasons ago. She climbed up into the glass cab, turned the key, and felt the massive diesel engine rumble to life beneath her. She started on the high ground. The yield was average, respectable, but nothing that was going to change her life. The drought had taken its toll, pulling her bushels per acre down to a frustratingly mediocre number. Then she turned the massive machine toward the 30-acre bottom. The slope was gentle, but the combine shifted its weight heavily as she eased it down into the depression. She lowered the corn header. The massive steel snouts slid between the rows. She engaged the separator. The machine roared, the noise deafening even inside the soundproofed cab. She pushed the hydro lever forward. The header hit the first stalks. Instantly, the yield monitor on the digital display spiked. The graph shot upward, turning from a steady yellow line into a bright, flashing green peak. Ruth stared at the screen. The numbers were climbing. 200 bushels an acre, 220, 250. The combine crawled forward, devouring the massive stalks, stripping the heavy ears, and spitting the shredded fodder out the back. The grain tank behind the cab began to fill at an alarming rate. It was a torrential downpour of golden corn. She had to stop halfway down the first row. The grain tank alarm blared, signaling it was full. She couldn't even make a complete pass without having to empty the hopper into the waiting grain cart parked at the edge of the field. Frank was driving the tractor, pulling the grain cart. As Ruth pulled the combine alongside and extended the unloading auger, Frank stepped out of his cab and stood on the tire. The golden grain poured from the auger in a thick, dusty waterfall. Frank looked at the sheer volume of the corn, then looked up at Ruth in the cab. He didn't say a word. He just slowly took off his battered seed cap and dragged his forearm across his forehead, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. It took 3 days to harvest the bottom. The logistics of moving that much grain out of such a small acreage stretched her resources to the absolute limit. She had to rent 2 extra semi-trucks just to haul the grain to the local elevator. When the final load crossed the scales at the co-op, the manager, an old guy named Bill who had known Ruth's father, printed out the receipt and handed it to her. "I ran the calibration on the scale twice this morning, Ruth," Bill said, leaning over the counter, his brow furrowed. "Because looking at these tickets, you just pulled 280 bushels an acre out of the bottom." "That scale is fine, Bill," Ruth said, folding the paper and slipping it into her chest pocket. "That land was a swamp last year. It's been a swamp since the county broke that pipe." "It just needed a little aggressive tilling," Ruth replied flatly. She walked out to her truck. She sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, and pulled the folded receipt out of her pocket. She looked at the final tally. She looked at the dollar amount printed at the bottom. It was enough. It was enough to pay off the operating loan entirely. It was enough to make a massive dent in the primary mortgage. It was enough to stop worrying about the bank for the first time in 5 years. She drove back to the farm. The sun was setting, casting a deep, amber glow across the valley. She parked the truck near the road and walked down to the edge of the 30-acre bottom. The field was bare now, covered in a thick layer of shredded corn stalks and leaves. The ground underneath was still dark, soft, and alive. It wasn't a dead zone anymore. It was the beating heart of her farm. As she stood there, a white county fleet truck came slowly down the gravel road. It was Greg. He stopped the truck right next to her, rolling down the window. He looked at the freshly harvested field, then at Ruth. He had the same laminated folder sitting on his passenger seat. "Looks like you had a good run down here," Greg said, his voice carrying a forced political friendliness. "Like I was saying in town, the drainage board is really pleased that the hydrostatic pressures equalized. We always knew that land had potential once the water table corrected." Ruth looked at him. She looked at his clean khakis and his soft hands resting on the steering wheel. She thought about arguing. She thought about explaining the ducks, the manure, the sheer, desperate panic of those first few weeks. She thought about screaming at him for the months of hell his broken pipe had caused her, but she didn't. She realized she didn't care what Greg thought or what the county claimed. Their ignorance was their problem. She just smiled. A slow, thin, totally humorless smile. "Yeah, Greg," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "The county did a hell of a job." Greg blinked, unsure if he was being mocked. He nodded awkwardly, rolled up his window, and drove away, leaving a trail of grey dust hanging in the cool evening air. Ruth turned back to the field. Winter was coming again. The ground would freeze, the snow would fall, and come spring, the bottom would be ready. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed a number she hadn't called in almost a year. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Midwest Hatchery. Hi, Ruth said, watching the last of the sunlight fade from the sky. I need to place an order for April delivery. Indian runners. Yeah, the working line. How many are you looking for this time? The voice asked. Ruth looked out over the 30 acres of perfect dark loam. Make it 4,000. Sometimes the best solutions aren't found in a boardroom or a county manual. They're found in the desperate, messy grit of people refusing to lose their livelihoods. Ruth didn't just drain a swamp. She built an ecosystem. If this story of rural resilience hit home for you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates hard work over empty promises. And don't forget to subscribe for more grounded, true-to-life stories from the heartland. Keep fighting for your ground.